America and the world rolled into the 1920s on the heels of the so-called War to End All Wars, World War I. In America, the decade is remembered as the Roaring Twenties, a time of peace and prosperity, a time when cars got faster, people got richer, and morals got looser. Although this is true, to a great extent all was not fun and games. The 20s also brought the violence of gang warfare, a massive resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and its hatred of blacks, Jews, and Catholics, and a widespread fear of communism that led to government raids, mass deportations, and infringement of rights and liberties. In this episode of Back in the Day, we will examine the culture and trends of the 20s and how events shaped that culture and influenced the lives and lifestyles of Americans. One of the biggest influences on the culture of the time was the enactment and enforcement of the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. It was the result of a decades-long effort by organizations such as the American Temperance Society, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union to stamp out liquor and the evil it brought to American society. Individual activists like Carrie Nation, who led attacks on bars and saloons armed with a hatchet, gained widespread notice, fame, and infamy as the temperance movement gained popularity in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. After passage of the amendment by Congress and ratification by the required number of states, Prohibition became the law of the land on the 17th of January, 1920. Although Prohibition was later seen as a failure and ultimately repealed, it had the widespread support of many Americans, at least during the early years. The Volstead Act, passed by Congress to define and enforce the amendment, prohibited the sale, manufacture, or transportation of beverages containing more than 0.5% alcohol, but there were a few loopholes that could be exploited. For example, doctors could prescribe alcoholic beverages for medicinal purposes, written for a variety of ailments such as anxiety, depression, pain control. It enabled patients to purchase up to a pint of liquor every 10 days. Many physicians made quite a business of dealing in these valued scraps of paper. Even Winston Churchill got in on it. After being struck by a car on a New York street, the future prime minister was prescribed an indefinite amount of alcohol to aid in his recovery. An exception was also made for sacramental wine used in religious services. Not surprisingly, many congregations soon saw an uptick in membership. Prohibition made it profitable to deal in illegal liquor. Although Canada enforced prohibition briefly at the end of World War I, it had largely been repealed by the time it was enacted in the U.S. Our northern neighbor became an attractive source of alcohol, both legal and illegal. Most of the Canadian hooch entered the U.S. at Detroit. These unfortunate bootleggers tried to cross the frozen Detroit River from Windsor. Mention of Prohibition also brings to mind organized crime syndicates led by infamous characters such as Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York. Their gangs monopolized the illegal alcohol trade in their claimed territories and tolerated no competition in their pursuit of profit. The violent turf wars that followed left many bloody corpses in their wake. The most famous of these battles is perhaps the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On the 14th of February, 1929, 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side gang were gunned down in a Chicago warehouse by members of a rival gang disguised as police officers. It was widely suggested that Al Capone was behind the hit, but no real evidence could be found. A popular and fondly remembered icon of the Roaring Twenties is the speakeasy, or blind pig. These illegal establishments served not only alcohol, but also food, and many featured live entertainment. In other words, there was very little difference between a typical speakeasy and a bar or restaurant either before or after Prohibition. Although many speakeasies were owned and operated by criminal syndicates or mob bosses, some were owned by ordinary citizens. However, most of these depended upon organized crime for their supply. Another popular nickname for the decade is the Jazz Age. Jazz, a uniquely American style of music, had its beginnings in the multicultural environment of New Orleans in the late 19th century, where African rhythms, traditional blues, and European-style harmony came together and produced something completely new. By 1920, jazz had spread northward to settle in what became centers of the movement in Chicago and New York. With the advent of radio, new music spread easily and quickly, and within a very short period of time, jazz was king. The most popular bands included Duke Ellington and his Washingtonians, Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, and King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. Popular songs included Rhapsody in Blue, Sweet Georgia Brown, and Ain't Misbehavin'. Here's a sample of what you might have heard if you were out on the town in the 20s. Fashion in the 20s featured a more relaxed style for both men and women. Men's suits, often of the three-piece variety, tended to be made of earth-tone fabrics with bold patterns. Pinstripes and checks were big. On the head, flat caps and fedoras were popular. For women, hemlines and sleeves got shorter. Short, bobbed hair was in, and skirts and dresses were loose and not restricting. For many, the iconic image of Roaring Twenties womanhood is that of the flapper. There's some disagreement about where the term flapper comes from, but the most likely source is from late 19th century England, where a young, highly spirited girl was compared to a young bird who is just learning to flap its wings. The flapper stereotype is of a young woman with bobbed hair, heavy makeup, and short skirt who smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and hung out at the jazz clubs. Of course, not all young women were flappers, but those who were, with their free-spirited ways, had a significant impact on American culture, not only during the 20s, but even today. If an average American today were asked to name a dance popular in the 20s, chances are that person would name the Charleston, named for the harbor city in South Carolina. While most agree that the dance evolved from an African-American dance style called Juba, it was a work in progress and underwent many changes before it emerged as the dance we know as the Charleston. Although primarily associated with the 20s, the Charleston didn't die with the decade. In many variations and forms, it continued to be quite popular in the days to come and is still danced today. In the 20s, the motion picture industry came into its own. Before World War I, moving pictures were considered a novelty. By the end of the 20s, advanced techniques, special effects, and synchronized sound made the motion picture a polished art form and the most popular form of entertainment. By 1929, more than 90 million people were going to the movies every week. Comedies were very popular at the time. Comic geniuses such as Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton kept Americans laughing through dozens of feature films. Lloyd began his career playing juvenile roles for Edison's Film Company before landing a job making movies for Hal Roach, later famous for his Our Gang comedies. Lloyd created a character called Lonesome Luke. These 1 and 2 reel comedies were very popular and brought both Lloyd and his character much public notice. By 1917, he grew tired of the Luke character and wanted to do something new. Although he had perfect eyesight, he donned a pair of glasses and created what became an icon of his career and of his life, the glass character. The spectacles gave Harold an ordinary, everyman appearance, a character ordinary people could relate to. His 1923 release, Safety Last, is a showcase of Harold Lloyd's talent and includes one of the most memorable scenes from the silent film era. Buster Keaton, another giant of the 1920s comedy scene, was also known for his flawless physical humor and stunts, beginning with the two-reel film 1 Week in 1920 and continuing through the decade to Steamboat Bill Jr. in 1928. Keaton consistently brought crowds to theaters across the nation. Keaton was particularly known for his very stoic expression while performing, resulting in his nickname, the Great Stone Face. Keaton's career faded somewhat in the 1930s and beyond, although his fame and reputation never died. Americans got more stuff in the 20s. New and improved consumer goods such as radio sets, refrigerators, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners hit the market. Due to mass production and the introduction of installment credit, you didn't have to be rich to buy these modern marvels, just $10 down and $10 a week. Don't wait. Put this new radio in your living room today. There were a lot more cars to choose from as well. From budget-priced Fords to top-of-the-line luxury models, there was a car for everyone. Like any era, the Roaring Twenties had its share of fads. One of the strangest was pole sitting. Dedicated and committed sitters would spend days and even weeks sitting atop a pole far above the ground. The most famous of these adventurers was Alvin Shipwreck Kelly. Some say he invented the fad in 1924 by spending more than 13 hours in the air. His last record, set in 1929, saw the determined Kelly spend 49 days on his pole. Another fad of the day was the dance marathon. In this sport, couples competed to see who could dance the longest. Although most of these dance-a-thons were over in less than 30 hours, some went on for days. Some might say that the marathons went too far. There were many reports of severe health issues, including physical exhaustion, dehydration, and even a few heart attacks. Another fad that perhaps went too far was the crossword craze. Although crossword puzzles had been around since 1913, the publication of a puzzle book in 1924 set off a massive crossword mania. Soon, it seemed that everyone was addicted to the puzzles. In fact, it was reported that couples were divorced because of it. Libraries had to limit the amount of time dictionaries were available to patrons because of the high demand. It is said that all things, both good and bad, must end. And that was true of the Roaring Twenties. Most people date the end of the era to the tragic stock market crash in October 1929 that ushered in the long, dismal days of the Great Depression. However, I think all would agree that the 1920s was a time quite unlike any other. It had its good times and bad, but it will never be forgotten.